design is conceiving and giving form to artifacts that solve problems. In other words, closing the gap. In our design process, we've worked pretty hard to develop a plan, that is to develop a design concept. But really the question is, are we actually closing the gap? One of the problems is that there's typically some drift from where the gap in the actual user experience is to what we've actually done or what we're actually building. So if you think about it conceptually, the user may have some actual ideal point for where they'd like the artifact to be. This is what they say they want. This is what we hear them say they want. And this is what we actually build. And there could be quite a bit of drift from where they actually started, that is what they actually want, to what we actually deliver. Our goal in concept testing is to discover that gap sooner rather than later, and that is to discover that gap while we're still defining the concept rather than after we've actually delivered the artifact. As I said when we discussed concept selection, if you're designing the artifact for you or for your own personal purposes, you don't really need to do any concept testing. You just go with the concept that you're most enthusiastic about, the one you actually want to pursue. But most of us do design in some kind of institutional context, often in the context of a company, and we're quite concerned with the question of, will users buy the design? Will they adopt the design? Do they prefer the design? And those are the settings in which concept testing is most important. One way to do that is with what's called a concept test survey. I'm just going to dive right in and show you one because I think it's easier to illustrate it with specifics. So here's a kind of concept test called a purchase intent survey. And the idea behind a purchase intent survey is that you sample a collection of users who are representative of a target audience, and you expose them to the design concept with some kind of description, and then you simply ask the question, how likely would they be to buy the product or to select the product? And so here is shown an ice cream scoop that's illustrated with just a black and white line drawing, and then some additional description, that it has an ergonomic grip, that it has this heavy aluminum scoop that stays warm for easy scooping, that it has colorful handle options, and that the scoop edge is contoured to slice through ice cream. And then the survey question itself simply asks, if you were choosing an ice cream scoop, how likely would you be to buy this scoop if it were available at a store where you normally shop for similar items? And the intention scale that's used is almost always this 5-point scale, which starts with definitely would not buy, goes to probably would not buy, might or might not buy, probably would buy, and then definitely would buy. And you simply ask the target user to indicate one of those choices, and then you infer from that how likely they would be to actually select the product. Now, you probably immediately see some of the problems with the concept test like this. First of all, one of the problems is how accurate the description is in communicating the essence of the design concept. Now here we have an illustration and some bullet points that try to describe the concept. But if you remember the scoop that's represented here, a lot of its appeal is kinesthetic, relates to the details of its appearance and to the way it feels. And this line drawing is probably not so good at actually communicating what the concept is all about. This photograph or rendering would certainly be better in doing that, but even still would not be as good as actually letting the user try a prototype or actually experience the finished product. Of course, the trade-off here is that you'd like to get this information early in the design process, and in general you won't have finished production intent prototypes until quite late in the process, till well after this information would be useful. And so this is typically a trade-off you face, which is getting the information early with a relatively less rich description of the artifact, versus getting it later when you can describe it accurately, but after that information is less useful. I would say parenthetically that the more novel the concept, and to some extent the newer the category of the artifact, the easier it is to describe the artifact with simply text or an illustration. For instance, if I were to describe a car rental service that meets you at the airport, at the airline gate as you get off the plane, I don't really need a drawing or a description of that. The textual description is pretty easy to understand. On the other hand, something like an ice cream scoop, where the category is quite mature, the differences among the various artifacts in the market are quite small, it's more important to have a model or a realistic representation of the artifact itself. One of the other problems with an intent survey like this is it asks for intention in isolation without asking the user to consider the competitive alternatives or the other choices that he or she might face. And for that reason, sometimes a forced choice is a better way to do the concept testing. A forced choice also lets you discriminate among several ideas or concepts that you might be considering. So here's a version of a concept test survey that follows the forced choice methodology, and it simply asks, if you were choosing an ice cream scoop, which of the following would you be most likely to purchase? And then articulates three distinct solution concepts. One, the one I've already described, and then this one that has this highly contoured handle with an ergonomic grip, a rubberized grip, and then Scoop C, which is quite distinct, which is an electric-powered heater to keep the scoop head warm. And then you force a choice, that is, ask the user, the respondent, to select only one of the three options. Now, a forced choice can be used with either the concepts that are under consideration by the designer or the design team. It could also include concepts that are already available in the market, that is, the dominant existing solutions, and that lets the team estimate what fraction of the market the team would likely garner if it were to compete with the products or artifacts that were available in the market already. Indeed, that leads me to the last point I want to make about concept testing, which is that the results from this kind of concept test can be used in forecasting. So, and they're used in a very simple arithmetic model that has the following form. You simply say you estimate the forecast units that would be sold per year or per time period as a function of four factors. First, the total number of units that are sold in the entire category per year. So this is all the artifacts of the category that the new artifact falls into that are sold in the market in the year. And then times the fraction of the market that's actually aware of the new product and that has access to the new product. So this might be the fraction of the market that your product has distribution in, or a geographic fraction of the market. It is rarely 100% because most new products are not fully available in the market, and it's quite rare to have the entire market aware of the new product. The third factor is the fraction of your survey respondents in your intent survey that actually selected the so-called top box. And in general, in purchase intent surveys, of these 5 boxes here, in most cases you ignore all responses other than the so-called top box, which is the definitely would buy box. And sometimes you also include the probably would buy. But that term in that equation is the fraction of respondents who actually selected the top box. So that might be 20% or 5% or 10% or whatever it is. And then the last factor accounts for the fact that respondents to surveys are typically over-optimistic, and they overestimate the likelihood they'll actually buy. So let me just give an example, a numerical example to wrap up. So let's imagine that in the ice cream scoop category that there are 2.5 million units sold in the ice cream scoop category per year. And maybe we could just call this in the US market, just to keep it simple. And then we could look at the fraction of the US market that's aware of the new product and has access to it. And let's assume that we're a small company, we are just getting started, and that we're in a small fraction of retailers. And so we have access and awareness of only 2%. And then the third factor, let's assume that of those that we've surveyed, 30% of them select the top box as they indicate they would definitely buy. And then lastly, we put in a factor that accounts for stated versus actual behavior, which is a factor of 25%, which means that if 100 people say they will buy, that actually only 25 of them actually will. And that's a typical value. That value varies by product category, but for a relatively low-cost consumer good like an ice cream scoop, 25 or 30% would be a typical number used in these models. And if you multiply that all out, you would end up with an estimate or a forecast for the new product of 3,750 units per year sold. Now, these forecasts are notoriously inaccurate, but they are generally, we've shown empirically that they are predictive of eventual sales. That is, they're correlated with what eventually happens in the marketplace, even though they are quite noisy. That is, your actual sales or the actual results are likely to vary quite a bit from the actual forecast. Having said that, it's really the best you can do, and it gives you some indication of how likely it is people will buy and whether indeed you've actually closed the gap as perceived by the user when exposed to your design concept.